All right, today, amid just the blitz of headlines on what has been a gigantic news day following a gigantic news week, you might not have noticed the news today. You might not have seen the headline today that today a federal court blocked the Trump administration from cutting energy funding just for blue states. This is billions of dollars Congress appropriated for clean energy projects of various kinds all over the country.
We are in a moment that feels relentless. Every day brings another ruling, another resolution, another escalation between Congress and the White House. And if you blink, you miss something that fundamentally shifts the balance of power. Let's start with the courts, because that's where the most immediate pushback is happening. A federal court stepped in and blocked an effort by the administration to withhold billions in energy funding from states that did not vote for the president.
Just in blue states, just in states that didn't vote for Trump, they would cut all of that funding. They'd leave the funding in place in states that voted for Trump. They would cut it in states that didn't vote for Trump. A federal court today ruled that that is illegal and stopped the Trump administration from doing that.
This wasn't discretionary campaign money. It was congressionally appropriated funding, already authorized and earmarked. The court's message was blunt. The executive branch does not get to punish states for their voting patterns. The power of the purse belongs to Congress. Selective retaliation violates both statute and constitutional structure. That wasn't the only ruling. Another federal court blocked an attempt to shut down an offshore wind project between Rhode Island and Connecticut. The administration argued executive authority over energy policy. The court responded that existing contracts, environmental approvals, and statutory frameworks cannot simply be undone for political reasons. Once again, the judiciary drew a line.
Another federal court today stopped Trump from shutting down a big offshore wind farm in Rhode Island and Connecticut. Trump's shutdown of that project, according to the courts today, was also illegal. And so yet another federal court blocked Trump on that as well, so that work on the wind farm will be able to go ahead.
Then came another injunction, billions in funding for child care and social services in predominantly Democratic-led states were frozen. And once again, a court reversed the move. Judges are no longer expressing surprise. They are issuing direct, repetitive refusals. The pattern is clear. Executive action, judicial block, repeat. While that legal back and forth continues, Congress is escalating on a different front. House Democrats have not confined themselves to press releases or cable news commentary. They have filed formal impeachment resolutions. These are not vague threats. They are structured, numbered, and drafted with constitutional language. House Resolution 353 lays out 7 articles.
He has attempted to conceal the evidence from Congress and from the American people. Our president holds the ultimate public trust. When he betrays that trust and puts himself before country, he endangers the Constitution, he endangers our democracy, and he endangers our national security.
7. That alone signals seriousness. The articles cover obstruction of justice, defiance of judicial orders, alleged human rights violations connected to immigration enforcement, usurpation of Congress's appropriations authority, abuse of trade powers, unauthorized military actions, violations of First Amendment protections, creation of unlawful offices, bribery and corruption, and a sweeping charge labeled tyranny. Each article attempts to connect specific actions to constitutional provisions.
The framers of the Constitution prescribed a clear remedy for presidents who so violate their oath of office. That is the power of impeachment. Today, in service to our duty to the Constitution and to our country, the House Committee on the Judiciary is introducing 2 articles of impeachment.
The resolution references Article 1's power of the purse, the War Powers Resolution, Supreme Court precedent on protected speech, and the explicit constitutional mention of bribery as an impeachable offense. Whether one agrees with the legal framing or not, the structure is deliberate. It is built as a prosecutorial document. House Resolution 537, introduced by Al Green, forced a vote under privileged status. The House could not avoid it. The resolution accused the president of abuse of power after statements were made that Democrats characterized as threats toward members of Congress. When the vote came, 237 members voted to table the resolution.
Rise to thank the 140 persons who on yesterday voted to support HRES 939, House Resolution 939.
But 140 voted against tabling it. That means 140 members were prepared to let impeachment proceed at that moment. That number matters. It represents nearly a third of the House willing to take the first step. Democratic leadership voted present, signaling strategy rather than rejection. They appear to be holding their fire, waiting for a more favorable political landscape. The Venezuela issue has added fuel. The administration authorized military action without seeking explicit congressional authorization. Critics argue that this violates the War Powers Resolution and Article 1's Declaration of War Authority. Supporters argue presidents have historically used limited force without formal declarations.
I rise to thank the 47 persons who did not oppose what we were doing, but chose to simply say, I will vote present. That was a significant vote as well. I rise to thank them. All of these persons.
But impeachment advocates see it as a fresh, contemporary example to add to their case. Jamie Raskin publicly suggested the move could justify a new impeachment inquiry. April McLean Delaney called for immediate proceedings. Maxine Waters indicated she is reassessing her position. This is not isolated rhetoric. It reflects internal Democratic deliberation about timing and feasibility. At the same time, pressure is extending beyond the president to cabinet officials. Nearly 160 House Democrats are backing articles of impeachment against the Secretary of Homeland Security. They argue constitutional violations, misuse of funds, and obstruction. The message is clear. The focus is not just on the president, but on the entire executive apparatus. Meanwhile, Senate Democrats are floating the 25th Amendment, arguing unfitness. That route would require cabinet cooperation and two-thirds of the Senate, a high bar. But the discussion itself adds to the atmosphere of crisis. The president's response has been consistent. Refusal, no resignation, no cabinet reshuffle, no policy reversal. At a Republican retreat, he reportedly told members plainly that if they lose the House in 2026, impeachment is inevitable. He has framed the midterms as a survival referendum. Hold the majority or face removal. That framing has transformed impeachment from a procedural possibility into a campaign rallying cry. It is being used to motivate turnout and enforce party loyalty. The message to Republicans is blunt. Your majority is my shield. The political calculus hinges on numbers. The Republican majority in the House is razor thin. 4 seats separate stability from vulnerability. If Democrats flip 5 seats in 2026, control shifts. If control shifts, impeachment resolutions move from symbolic to actionable. Should that occur, House Resolution 353 could advance to committee hearings. Witnesses could be subpoenaed. Military decisions, immigration policies, trade actions, and financial records could be examined under oath. A third impeachment would become reality. Simultaneously, articles against the DHS secretary could proceed. Multiple impeachment tracks could unfold at once. Senate trials would be required for conviction. The likelihood of removal would depend on Senate composition and whether Republican senators break ranks. The president is wagering that Republican unity will hold. He is betting that polarization outweighs fatigue. But warning signs exist. Approval ratings have declined. Policy support has narrowed. Major donors are reportedly cautious. Courts have issued repeated rebukes. Redistricting battles in states like California are reshaping the electoral map. Small-dollar donor enthusiasm has softened. At CPAC, tariffs were reportedly met with audible disapproval from segments of the crowd. Economic strain affects swing voters more than partisan loyalists. Supreme Court rulings have chipped away at certain executive defenses. Even some former allies have publicly expressed concern. All of this feeds into the midterm equation. Historically, presidents lose House seats in midterms. If that pattern repeats and margins are slim, a 5-seat swing is plausible. And if that happens, the impeachment machinery is ready. Democrats are not improvising. They have drafted articles. They have forced votes. They have identified new triggers like Venezuela. They have expanded focus to cabinet members. They are building a record in the congressional record itself. The president could attempt de-escalation. He could adjust policy, fire controversial officials, or seek bipartisan compromise to blunt impeachment momentum. Instead, he has chosen confrontation. He has turned defiance into identity. That strategy may energize his base. It may also harden opposition. If Republicans retain the House, impeachment threats stall. If Democrats gain control, the confrontation becomes institutional. This is not hypothetical theater. The votes, filings, and court rulings are real. The constitutional mechanisms exist. The numbers are narrow. The midterms are approaching. The standoff is unprecedented in its intensity, but structurally familiar. Separation of powers under strain. Courts check executive action. Congress prepares oversight. The executive resists. Voters ultimately decide which branch gains leverage. The question is whether the president's gamble on party loyalty will outlast demographic shifts, donor fatigue, judicial pushback, and electoral math. If it does, impeachment resolutions remain dormant. If it fails, the constitutional crisis he is resisting becomes unavoidable. For now, the administration stands firm. Congress escalates, courts intervene, and the 2026 midterms loom as the decisive inflection point that will determine whether these impeachment articles remain symbolic documents or become the basis for the most consequential trial in modern American political history. What makes this moment even more combustible is that it's not just about one dispute or one policy. It's about cumulative strain. Each confrontation on its own might be survivable. A court blocks a funding freeze. Another injunction halts a policy change. An impeachment resolution gets filed and tabled. None of those events alone ends a presidency. But taken together, they create a pattern of friction between branches that is accelerating rather than cooling. The courts are increasingly assertive. Judges are not issuing narrow technical corrections. They are issuing sweeping injunctions that question the legal foundation of executive actions. When funding is frozen contrary to congressional intent and courts restore it, that is a direct rebuke to the administration's interpretation of its own authority. When a military action becomes the subject of impeachment debate, that signals a breakdown in trust between Congress and the executive branch. There is also a strategic element in how Democrats are pacing their actions. They are not forcing every vote immediately. They are allowing record building. Each resolution, each committee statement, each court opinion becomes part of a cumulative dossier. By the time 2026 arrives, if they regain control, they will not need to start from scratch. The framework will already exist. The president's camp understands this, which is why the messaging has become so binary. Keep the House or face impeachment. It simplifies the stakes into a loyalty test. That approach may consolidate core support, but it also locks the administration into a single defensive position. There is no room for concession in that narrative. Any compromise could be framed as weakness, and weakness undermines the rallying strategy. At the same time, Senate dynamics complicate the picture. Even if the House impeaches, conviction requires a two-thirds Senate vote. That means Republican senators would need to join Democrats in substantial numbers. Historically, that has been unlikely, but political pressure can shift calculations if electoral losses pile up, if approval ratings remain suppressed, if donor networks fracture. Some senators may begin to view distance as survival. The cabinet impeachment angle adds another layer. If the House were to impeach both the president and a cabinet secretary, Senate trials could overlap. That would create prolonged media saturation. Hearings would dominate headlines for weeks or months. Even absent conviction, the reputational damage could be severe. Internationally, the spectacle of multiple impeachment proceedings would signal instability. Markets tend to react to uncertainty. Allies and adversaries alike monitor internal political volatility. Prolonged constitutional conflict affects more than domestic optics. Meanwhile, the judiciary remains an unpredictable variable. Supreme Court decisions narrowing executive protections could embolden congressional oversight. Lower court injunctions could accumulate into a narrative of executive overreach. Every adverse ruling becomes rhetorical ammunition in impeachment arguments. There is also the voter psychology factor. Midterms often hinge on turnout and intensity. By turning impeachment into a referendum, both sides risk over-mobilizing the opposition. If Republican voters treat the election as a defensive stand for the presidency, turnout could surge. If Democratic voters see a real path to accountability, their turnout could surge as well. 5 seats. That is the numerical fulcrum. It is a small margin in a country of hundreds of millions. Campaign funding, district boundaries, local economic conditions, and candidate quality will all matter. A handful of suburban districts could determine whether impeachment remains theoretical or becomes procedural. The president's refusal to make personnel changes, particularly in response to threats targeting specific cabinet officials, signals confidence, but it also eliminates off-ramps. Historically, presidents have used resignations or firings to diffuse congressional anger. That tool is currently off the table. If Democrats regain the House, impeachment articles could move quickly. Committee hearings could begin within weeks. Subpoenas would be issued. Depositions would follow. The news cycle would compress into daily revelations and testimony. If Republicans hold the House, the immediate threat subsides, but the documented grievances remain. The resolutions do not disappear. They simply wait. The president would still face courts declining approval and donor hesitancy. Survival would not mean stability. It would mean postponement. There is a broader constitutional lesson unfolding. The system is stress-tested not when everyone agrees, but when branches collide. The framers designed impeachment as a political safeguard, not a criminal verdict. Its activation depends on political alignment, not solely legal conclusions. So we are watching 2 parallel processes: legal rebuke through courts and political escalation through Congress. The executive branch is resisting both. The electorate will ultimately arbitrate which side gains leverage. The 2026 midterms are not just another election cycle. They are shaping up to be a referendum on whether the impeachment articles filed today become historical footnotes or the foundation of a third impeachment trial. Until then, the standoff continues. Courts issue orders. Congress files resolutions. The president refuses to yield, and the margin, just a handful of seats, hangs over everything. As we move deeper into this confrontation, the real story isn't just about impeachment language or court injunctions. It's about endurance. How long can a presidency function effectively while under constant legal, political, and institutional assault? That's the deeper question simmering beneath all of this, because governing requires cooperation. It requires at least a minimal level of functional trust between the branches of government. When that trust erodes completely, every policy becomes a battlefield. Every funding decision becomes a lawsuit. Every executive action becomes grounds for investigation. And that's where things are headed. Look at the mechanics. If Democrats retake the House, the first phase wouldn't even be impeachment votes. It would be investigations, subpoenas, document requests, testimony under oath, committee hearings stretching for weeks. That process alone can reshape public opinion. The Watergate hearings didn't begin with removal. They began with slow, methodical evidence gathering. The same template exists here, and the president's calculation appears to be that polarization will neutralize accountability, that if voters are split enough, impeachment becomes just another partisan fight rather than a constitutional reckoning. That bet assumes his coalition holds firm. But coalition fatigue is real. Every election cycle drains resources. Every scandal tests loyalty. Every court loss chips away at inevitability. There's also something else unfolding quietly: institutional memory. Members of Congress who were reluctant to push impeachment before are watching patterns accumulate. Military authorization disputes, appropriations conflicts, court defiance claims, cabinet controversies. The more those episodes stack up, the harder it becomes for moderate members to dismiss them as isolated incidents. Meanwhile, Senate Democrats talking about the 25th Amendment adds rhetorical pressure even if it remains politically unrealistic. The 25th requires cabinet participation, that is, an extraordinarily high threshold. But invoking it signals that some lawmakers view the situation as beyond mere policy disagreement. Even if it doesn't move forward, the discussion itself alters the political atmosphere. The president's defiance strategy depends heavily on party discipline. 4 seats in the House, that's the firewall. But special elections, retirements, redistricting challenges, and turnout fluctuations can erode narrow margins quickly. A single wave in suburban districts could flip control. If that happens, timelines compress dramatically. Within weeks of a new Congress being sworn in, impeachment articles could advance out of committee. Floor votes could follow. The Senate would be forced into trial mode. Chief Justice presiding, evidence presented, senators sworn in as jurors. It would dominate the national conversation, and even if conviction fails, the optics of a third impeachment trial would be historic. No modern president has faced that scenario. It would redefine the presidency's boundaries and test the durability of partisan loyalty in the Senate. Financial markets would likely react to prolonged uncertainty. Policy negotiations would stall. International negotiations could slow as foreign governments assess political stability. Even routine legislation could become collateral damage. On the other side, if Republicans retain control, the administration survives the immediate threat, but not the scrutiny. Investigations would continue in minority form. Lawsuits would persist. Media narratives would remain saturated. The difference would be procedural power, not the disappearance of conflict. There's also the matter of precedent. If impeachment becomes normalized as a recurring tool rather than a rare constitutional remedy, future presidencies may operate under constant removal threats. That shifts how executive authority is exercised. It changes incentives. The 2026 election, therefore, becomes less about ideology and more about constitutional direction. Voters will decide whether to escalate confrontation or stabilize the balance. The president has framed it as a survival vote. Democrats have framed it as an accountability vote. Both narratives are powerful mobilizers, but what makes this moment uniquely volatile is that neither side appears interested in de-escalation. The president refuses concessions. Congressional Democrats refuse silence. The courts refuse deference when statutory limits are crossed. All 3 branches are engaged simultaneously, and history shows that prolonged multi-branch conflict rarely resolves quietly. It culminates in either electoral realignment, negotiated compromise, or institutional rupture. Which path emerges will depend on turnout, margins, and whether party loyalty outweighs constitutional caution. For now, the stalemate holds. The House majority is razor thin. Impeachment articles sit filed but inactive. The president continues forward as if nothing fundamental has shifted. But beneath the surface, the groundwork is being laid for a potentially seismic turn, because 5 seats can change everything, and everyone involved knows it.